The Soldier, Time of Tempests, Year 3. Failure, and Success. She had lost count of how many times the ceiling had swam back into her vision. How many numbers had passed through her mind, and how long it had been since the minutes climbed their steady descent into hours. If she listened carefully, she could almost hear the sound of discussion going strong not so far away. She had tried to tell herself it wasn't unusual, but had already grown exhausted by the happy, smiling faces, amongst other things. Her spine was starting to protest the repeated exercise, though she had gotten very good at ignoring any complaints her body gave her. After all, she hadn't achieved any of her goals, and she was still. Ruslana set her arms under her head and reset her mental count. It was time for another repetition, anyway.
Discipline is not enough. Any soldier can become disciplined. It is the chain of the officer to think past discipline, to be an island unto themselves while never pausing and never faltering. You must be civil, you must be concise. You must never allow for the possibility of hope to diminish. You must be strong.
A year ago, maybe. She hadn't shaved her head regulation short, then, on a dare, Ruslana had let it grow out, to see if anyone truly cared. And maybe because she had had an eye for the person who had raised the challenge to her in the first place. Now gone, of course. But no one had, because there were far more pressing things to worry about. She had hated herself at the time for doing something so pointlessly foolish, but at the same time it was one of the few memories she could picture reliably when exercise and response blurred together in some fragmented dance.
Is it all right if I intrude?
Of course, Grendolf was there. It wasn't even unusual to see the lich in her memories. At first, Ruslana had felt like protesting, but it had quickly been replaced with a sense of resignation, if she had to put it to words. There was nothing she had that had been private. Nothing really hers. An officer's life encouraged that.
Sure. Just replaying old memories. Trying to understand how I fucked up.
Ruslana knew she sounded more bitter than she meant to, as she started counting again. There was a weird kind of dualism in separating exercises from memories, but the strain of the former kept her from getting lost in the latter, so she liked it, or something close enough to like.
I'm sure the other humans would love to interact with you. Just because we failed, does not mean.
But here, Grendolf went silent, too. Looking comical from where he stood in between two faceless soldiers, the grey edges of their skin obscuring names that Ruslana knew she should remember, should try to remember.
Don't worry about them. Civvies should keep to themselves. I'm sure I'll feel up to it later.
Thankfully, the lich didn't attempt to counter what she said. If nothing else, he was courteous when it came to her. What? Her introversion? Her curtness? Her inability to win, when that had been necessary? For this world, if not hers? Damn it, damn it, damn it.
I do not mean to criticize, but you're going to feel this later. Perhaps you could take a break? Even if it were just to clear your head for a moment.
Ruslana wanted to be angry, but she had already moved beyond that. Mom had said something like, anger only served for the first couple of minutes. After that, it just held you back, kept you blind, made you dumb. Grendolf was right, of course, and, sighing, Ruslana rose to her feet. Still refusing to budge from memory.
Are you looking for something? Not really. Just trying to, you know, get my head clear. Feel like a human being, maybe.
Laughing quietly, Ruslana snapped her fingers.
Trying to avoid making other people uncomfortable. At the end of the day, the past is all bad blood, and maybe no one else but me sees it that way, but I don't think messing up the happiness of others is something a soldier should do. Yes, because holing up in her quarters is much more mature.
She couldn't see it, but she was certain that the lich was smirking, even if his skeletal features rarely betrayed his expression. Shaking her head and purposely ignoring him, Ruslana walked amongst her colleagues, expression slowly dimming.
A lot of these guys. You know how it is. It's all so sudden, and then there's nothing at all, just memory and loss. Maybe if someone else had gotten in, we would have kept Dragunov from waking up, stopped Leo.
Grendolf curiously prodded one of the figures, whose camo turned into grey dust as they melted away into the sea of her memories. The Lich at least had the decency to look surprised and not a little embarrassed by the results of his action, though she couldn't imagine he was actually surprised. But then again, that was kindness, sometimes. Trying to make people feel less alone in their own head.
Perhaps. That doesn't change the reality of what will happen, however, nor what we might do, now. Certainly losing your determination here would be. Ha, I'm fine. I'm just. How trustworthy are you, Grendolf? Really trustworthy, because I don't want this secret spilled unless you'll take it to your final grave. Assuming, that is, you ever truly bite it.
She didn't mind the crypt wheezing of his laughter, maybe she'd even grown to like it. She didn't mind either the way the classroom and its plotting board and the dim lights on the wall faded into the background as she cast for a memory she had been looking for, and could not find it, and gave up.
I have been told that I am very untrustworthy, and more to the point I have told others not to rely on me. My word is bound by honor, however, as you well know. And more than that, I have none who I care to share secrets with now, though perhaps I shall grace you with some, in time.
She smiled, and opened her eyes.
I'm really nervous. I wouldn't say I'm shy or anything. I just don't know how to entertain people. And with the weather sounding like a hurricane in a pseudo-paper bag out there, it's my obligation to do just that.
Around her, the look and smell of her quarters came back to her, so much more modest than the grid complex back home, but no less Spartan. She had gone through cleaning it several times, not because she enjoyed cleaning it, but because it gave her something to do. Proof she was alive, maybe. There was one bed, underused, and one shelf, empty, even though she had promised Grendolf she'd read some of the books he had brought, later. He had assured her that a good friend had recommended them, but... And there was a desk, and only here was clutter allowed to live and thrive. She had allowed herself the vanity of a mirror, and the small mercy of a private shower that was a luxury they hadn't been able to afford back home. But that was it, because nothing else was needed. Grendolf was shaking his rust-toned skull with a quiet and clicking murmur of good-natured disbelief, though she was somewhat pleased to note that he hadn't challenged her half-lie, either. They had a good relationship, like that.
I can relate, somewhat. There is no ease in these things. I find that even when I am with peers in neutral grounds, talking about minor things, trivialities, and the like, when there are so many pressing concerns, it is at once tiresome and terrifying. She hoped the look in her eye made it clear she wasn't going anywhere with this, and he could keep talking as she stared into the mirror. Her face stared back at her, and it took her a few minutes to break her sour expression. Not trying, however, is the same as defeat.
Ruslana gave a terse and fumbled for her razor. She had been such a fool to try for the half braid. She had felt it made her look cooler, older, stronger. It had reminded her of someone, after all. But that girl, the witch. She had worn it so much better, with the way Koza had wove it. A proper braid, too. One like you would hear about in old stories. And here Ruslana was, playing at things and trying to be something she wasn't. Not that she minded the familiar snip of her hair as it fell around, there was a wonderful cool feeling about the air, and it brought with it encouragement of its own. You can do this. She still didn't like what she saw in the mirror. Somehow, she felt more pug-nosed and dour-looking than before, all drawn out and tired, but then again, she had just been mauled pretty badly, magic or no. And worst concerns aside.
Grendolf, weird question. Do you think? How do you greet people? Make them feel like you're here to look out for them. Not just watch over them but watch out for them. Arbitrary distinction, I know, but...
Ruslana smiled and turned away from the mirror, perhaps not entirely satisfied, but not unpleased, either. The ancient lich had been watching her and she caught a somewhat strange solemnity to his expression, perhaps because they both knew what lay ahead, now that Dragunov had awoken. Or perhaps, one of his own memories, kept so furtively under lock and key, was plaguing the depths of his mind.
Far beyond me to help you there, I'm afraid. Most magic users are focused or mad, and sometimes both. Outside of socializing with one another, we aren't too much for socializing.
Laughing, she elbowed him in the side, amazed as usual by how fortified his ancient bones actually were. Perhaps next time, he could take point.
That sounds like a cowardly generalization. I guess that means it's up to me to break new ground for the both of us. Strange, isn't it? I kind of wonder what Kaylee would have thought of all of this. She'd probably just run in there. Larger than life, and everyone'd be friends by the end of it.
To her surprise, it wasn't just her. Grendolf had started laughing, himself.
Without doubt. Barbaric to the end, and yet with an energy you can't forget. The essence of what it means to be a hero, I should say.
Ruslana ran her fingers over her freshly shorn hair, and admired the coppery newness against them.
Problem is, I'd just want her to do all the talking, I think. Listening to her talk, you would forget how grim things are. People are. Isn't?
Her words trailed off, and it took Ruslana a moment to realize she had fallen down around herself onto the cold, poured concrete floor. Pulling her arms around her waist, Ruslana took several deep breaths, and then managed to bite back any hint of emotion that had tried to battle for control of her waning smile.
Feels strange. Talking to you like this. About Kaylee.
Grendolf smoothed his robes and dropped to the ground next to her, clutching his skull in one elongated and sharpened hand.
Is it acceptable? I will leave, if... Please don't. Please.
So they waited, and Ruslana closed her eyes once more. How had Kaylee Muir managed to stay so hopeful, so good, in spite of it all? In spite of everything?
I'm not her. And where we come from, there aren't kingdoms or princesses or heroes or knights. Just, there's this awful, terrifying desire to cling to life. And through it, people are still people. They're good. They want to do good. I want to do good.
Ruslana felt the dryness in her throat subside, and took another deep breath. The air around her felt thin, but it always did, here. She would never fully get used to the strangeness of this place, even if the atmosphere was entirely the same and entirely breathable, even if it was mostly full of friends, even if there hadn't been such troubles. It was not home. It was not filled with the smoggy neglected scent of dying machines and dying people. There was no need to watch the sky for shrapnel and rain, at least not until now. And the hazards here were real, but so different as to feel entirely alien.
And at the end, back home, it was our job to try to protect what was left. Grendolf, I don't even know if there was any civilization outside of the yards, and what was there wasn't close. It was very brutal. Very short. And I came here, and I failed here, too.
Ruslana shivered, but felt even-handed. The ground was solid under her feet, and she could feel memory at hand, and her eyes were unclouded as she stared up at the ceiling. All unblemished concrete, staring sightlessly back. She could, and would, survive.
There is nothing that can make up for that. I won't let it slow me down. But, to go in there, and exchange careless smiles and words. I can't.
Of course, she hadn't imagined the day when a lich as burnished red as ground lilies would be attempting to comfort her, but she had tried to avoid too much fantasizing back home. It had been a nice place to escape to from time to time, but it always betrayed you in the end. Except, now, that was happening, and it felt normal. Perhaps, Ruslana mused, the idea of fantasy and reality as being separate from one another was one of those little lies that tripped up the soldier from the officer in the first place, and perhaps, like magicians, all officers were either driven or mad.
Do you miss her, often? I do not mean. Absolutely. I think about what she'd say in any given situation, all the time. It wasn't even as long as it should have been, but all my acquaintances, none have been like Kaylee was. She.
Suddenly, Ruslana had it, and it was so sudden and stupid and simple that she felt the smile come before it had, and it was an equally trite smile, the kind she might have distrusted on anyone else, but in that moment it spread until she couldn't help it. She was laughing and smiling and wished Calimere could see her.
We should probably just get rid of my other eye while we're at it. I've got a request. Any chance I could requisition a favor?
Outside, the air was crisp. No longer cold like it had been, but brisk and buzzing with the quiet thrum of electricity. Ruslana felt the weather was like a coil, perhaps a spring waiting to go off, meaning all the more reason to keep people together, unified, and safe. Storms and lightning were far from the only danger out there, of course. The bags under her arms were heavy and plastic, and had strange emblems she had never seen before. Grendolf had promised that they were safe, at least so safe enough for her purposes, and not riddled with contaminants. And as to their contents, once she had made her way to the, thankfully empty, mess hall, they seemed safe, too. Flour, honey, apples, plums, and an assortment of berries that she was just going to have to trust were safe for consumption. Not that she didn't want to trust Grendolf, but the tiny, bluish-black fruits tasted bitter and tart, with a sweet aftertaste that almost reminded her of the artificial cranberry jam that was served as an ubiquitous condiment back home, but this was real, had grown from a tree once, and not been synthesized in a laboratory or grown quickly under the earth. Unable to keep herself from smiling, Ruslana brushed the juice off her lips and set to work. It had been an awfully long time since she had done something like this for fun, and watching the fruit boil was oddly calming, the scent of sucrose and steam feeling like old friends.
What exactly are you making? Pastilla. Quickly made, too. You're supposed to cook them longer. Let them become soft and wispy. I think the ephemerality is part of the charm.
Grendolf had appeared as suddenly as he did, hovering over the somewhat jury-rigged cooking complex with a look of recollection and loss.
I suppose they must taste rather pleasant. Probably, but like most recipes I know, you would be better off consulting a trained chef, and not a hobbyist. I thought about making something more time-consuming, maybe a proper cake, or something more savory, but
both went silent as, with a great deal of care that Grendolf had not seen so frequently on the soldier's face, she separated the tiny slabs of fruit candy, and dutifully flattened them out against a baking sheet that had actually been made in district, and stood out for both its reliability, and its unremarkability.
It would not hurt you to go talk to them. You already know the loud, bothersome one.
She could hear the quiet, dry humor in his voice and refused to take the bait even though she didn't disagree, entirely.
Isn't too good to talk poorly about your guests, Lich. Ah, perfect. Just let me cut these.
Each tiny delicacy looked pretty good, she admitted to herself with no small amount of pride. Especially since she had just been going off of memory, and it had been a long time, indeed. Not looking right at her, Grendolf made a strange, amused noise, and proffered forward a platter of some indistinguishable origin. It was rather quaint, Ruslana felt. Like something you would hear about in a story of a distant time where everything had very rustic floral designs. Which she didn't mind in the slightest, but she had the unshakable feeling that this piece hadn't been salvaged from some other place or time by the Lich.
Thanks. No, more appropriately, thank you kindly. For bearing with me. Don't like to keep my mind on the bad for too long, even less to drag others into it.
Both soldier and Magus stared down at the tiny lances of colorful, sugar-encrusted jam pate arranged with great care beneath them. Once again, Grendolf seemed amused, but also.
Think nothing of it. It is impossible to work well when you are lost. Yeah. I suppose it is.
Ruslana cast her gaze outside, to where the ground had grown bare, and the faintest hint of gentle blue grass was starting to poke nervous blades up into the still cool air.
After all this, Grendolf, we'll think of something. I don't know what yet, but we'll think of something. There's still hope, even if we failed now. I don't think I'm cut out to deal with problems like Kaylee would. But that doesn't mean.
The tray shook slightly, and she steadied it subconsciously.
Well, I'm going into the real battle, now. Wish me luck. I shall. I would offer to join you, but, so it is, and so it goes. I think I will go think, for a while. Perchance to find a solution to our concerns. At least the weather will not be our enemy, for once. Until then, Ruslana. Yeah. Until then.
And he disappeared, so easily. No real goodbye or farewell, but she knew kind of the sentiments he felt. It was weird. It would never stop being weird. Part of her still wanted to have a reason to fight him. But beneath her hands, rough and unsteady as they were, was a beige and brown floral plate loaded with candies that would not eat themselves, and anyone who so readily had something like this ready, she couldn't view them as an enemy, at least right now. The time for reviewing the situation would come, but for now. Her breath tasted cold as she inhaled, and Ruslana approached tunnel number 4 with a nervous smile, perhaps too wide, and a tap of her foot against pressed steel, to serve as a knock. After a while, something scampered up the hatch and opened it up. Something, in this case, being Paul.
Oh. Hey. Was wondering where you had got to. Can't believe you've met so many people I know. Well, I don't really like being under the thumb of the military again, but what can you do? Even if I'm not technically selling anything, I'm still viewing it as selling hope. And noodles.
With one hand on the hatch and another presumably on the ladder down, he still managed to adjust his glasses. She wasn't entirely fond of the vendor, but it took impressive coordination, she had to admit.
Had a lot to think about, decided to arrive bearing gifts and a winning smile. Any chance I can join you all?
Paul's smug expression only widened, and he gave a broad shrug of his shoulders.
Don't see why not. Hey. The boss lady's here. And she brought gifts, I think.
She could hear Paul scampering back down the ladder, and took several deep breaths. Right. It was now or never. A lot of people had praised the effects of liquid courage to her, though the appeal had always been lost. Anything that ran out when you needed it most, that wasn't what she wanted to be thinking about. Ruslana's eyes adjusted to the slight darkness, even with the various jewels and gems, or maybe gem-like superstructures. The Boulder folk had set up, unlike the relatively clutter-free chambers she kept for her personal use, the tunnels had quickly accrued all the clutter of life. Many kinds of life, at that. Someone had set up a dartboard which hadn't weathered thrown rocks used as darts, well, at all. A plotting table that she had found rather nice had been cleared of all the plotting cards she and Grendolf had thrown together and used as a meal table turn round table turn footrest, and for some reason Boleslava was rolling around on top of it, looking slightly surprised at her arrival. Despite the room not being filled with smoke, it felt as if it should be, perhaps, or maybe that was just her read of Koza. She had wandered back in with a big grin on her face, all crooked teeth and happy smiles, and at first, Ruslana had been suspicious that maybe someone had taken pity on her and given her smokes. But that hadn't been the case, and it turned out the stubborn older lady had just been sitting around and tossing the literal stones with Binky, who threw them with surprising gentleness, considering his incredible size. Once again, Ruslana felt a tinge of hope that she might be able to convince the Cyclops, at least, to stay around, but that was unlikely. And in lieu of recent events, it seemed more obvious than ever that fixed fortifications were proof of the folly of humanity, or however it had went. She wasn't sure what to make of the settlers from the forest jungle colony nearby. The human, Zhao? He seemed friendly enough. Yarder through and through, with the kind of optimism that hurt to look at. Maybe they could trade resources or something, and she liked seeing the walls covered with stories in paint. Maybe, long after they'd all disappeared, someone'd see the dried paint and ghost of illustrations against the ruined husks of district above, and try to puzzle out what happened, when they returned home. Yeah. They'd get back home. The thought filled her with a sudden determination as she set the tray down carefully against the former plotting table, or nearly set it down. A blur of movement nearby set off her reflexes, and her fingers pulled the tray back the moment that the really energetic plant girl dashed on by, carrying gallons of paint under each arm and talking a mile a minute. Zhao laughed, gave her a high five, and she flashed Ruslana a huge smile. Ruslana struggled to return it, feeling a little overwhelmed. Thankfully, Zemby was off again in an instant, even if she did nearly stumble over the table while walking around it. Ruslana was more adept at dealing with bones, though the kind old skeleton made it easy for everyone to deal with him, and Ruslana hoped it said more about his kindly nature than the fact that most of the people she had befriended recently were dead. One way, or the other. Her vision swam a bit, and Ruslana sat down, head in hands. Her fingers felt tinier, not strong enough, not calloused enough, and the atmosphere of the room felt hemmed in and smothering. But once again, she forced herself to breath, and look up, just missing a dry green light as it flickered and disappeared. So. Facing the wall as if she had been talking to it, the young woman removed what looked to be headphones of some kind. They had a decidedly demonic bent to them, and Ruslana could see nothing that they were attached to, but it was clear some music, or perhaps a voice, had been drifting through them. Her wheelchair creaked as she turned around, and smiled, and... So. The witch, Lorelei, was younger, and yet she seemed to have been through a lot, possibly more than Ruslana had. Her hat was almost stereotypical in what Ruslana imagined a witch to look like, and couldn't have clashed more with that sweater, much beloved, even where the stars that emblazoned it had started to fade a bit. And somehow, her eyes held that kind of bright gentleness that made her feel that everything was going to be all right, and that frightened her, and she couldn't even say why. Maybe because she was a skeptic, and knew that couldn't be true. Maybe it was because magic hadn't saved them yet, despite the strength she had seen in it, friend and foe. Maybe it was because, in this world, it seemed like a witch could command tides and stars, and all a grunt could do was to try, and fight, and fail. But somehow, that didn't matter too much anymore, and the weariness slowly faded away from Ruslana's face as she cleared her throat, tapping the table lightly with one hand.
Felt I'd bring you some celebratory confections. I realize not all of us have been properly introduced, but I'm Ruslana, and it's really good to see so many of you alive.
At the time, she didn't even realize the significance of it, only that she was glad when the conversation immediately drew to a halt and then reconstructed itself around her arrival, and how tasty, if slightly chewier than expected, the pastilla were, and it was as if she had always been present. Chapter end.